Right, let's kick things off and dive right into a topic that, well, seems to get every football fan fired up. I'm talking about VAR, the video assistant referee. And look, we know you've heard it all before, the arguments, the complaints, the occasional praise. But today, we're going to try to cut through all the noise. We've got a ton of research articles, even listen to some pretty intense podcast debates. And we're going to pull out what we think are the most interesting insights to, well, help us all understand the real impact VAR is having on the game. I mean, did you know there's research suggesting defenders are actually less likely to make risky tackles in the box now because, well, they know VAR is watching. It's kind of wild, right? But before we go there, we should probably make sure everyone's on the same page about what VAR is and what it's, supposed to be doing.
Yeah, good point. It's easy to get caught up in the back and forth without remembering the basics. I mean, at its core, VAR is just a tool, right? It's there to help referees review certain decisions using video replays. The goal is to cut down on those game-changing mistakes, those moments where everyone's screaming, how did the ref miss that?
Okay, right, because refs are human, obviously. They're going to make mistakes sometimes. But that's where things get kind of tricky.
Oh.
Because some people say VAR has taken away the human element of football and made it too, I don't know, clinical almost. Like, remember that offside call where the attacker was like barely offside? They were using VAR to check if his toenail was off. It was ridiculous.
Ah, yeah, the toenail offside. I remember that one. It caused a huge uproar. And
Yeah.
it really highlights one of the biggest criticisms of VAR, and that's how it disrupts the flow of the game. I mean, those long pauses for reviews, they can really kill the excitement, for players and fans. It's like all of a sudden the energy just drains out of the stadium.
It's true. It's like watching paint dry sometimes, waiting for the ref to make a decision. And it's not just the fans either. I've even heard commentators saying it's changed the way players celebrate goals. They're kind of hesitant to go all out now because they're not even sure if the goal's going to stand. It's almost like VAR sucks the joy out of the moment.
You've hit on something really important there, and it's not just about the time it takes, It's also the psychological effect VAR has. It affects everyone. That uncertainty, the waiting and wondering, can really take away from the emotional experience of the game.
Okay, and speaking of uncertainty, can we please talk about the handball rule? I mean, I thought VAR was supposed to make things clearer, but honestly, I think I'm more confused now than ever. Every week, there's a new interpretation, a new controversy. It's like, what even is a handball anymore?
Yeah, you're definitely not alone in feeling that way. The handball rule is a perfect example of where VAR hasn't really solved the problem of subjectivity. In fact, some people argue it's actually made it worse by, highlighting those inconsistencies in how the rule is applied.
So maybe the issue isn't the technology itself. Maybe it's the rules. Is VAR just showing us the flaws that were already there?
That's a really good question, and it's something FIFA and the rulemaking bodies are really struggling with. I mean, VAR has forced everyone to take a closer look at the rules and ask if they're really fit for purpose in this new age of high-tech officiating.
Okay, so we've been pretty hard on VAR so far, but let's try to see the other side for a minute. I mean, there have to be times when VAR got things right.
Oh, absolutely. Think about goal line technology. That's essentially a form of VAR, and it's been pretty widely accepted. It's removed any doubt about whether the ball crossed the line, and I don't think anyone's complaining about that.
That's a good point. So maybe there's a way to refine VAR, to find a middle ground, use it to correct those really obvious blunders without getting bogged down in every tiny detail.
That's the million-dollar question. A lot of experts think the key is to limit VAR to clear and obvious errors, but, what does that actually mean?
Yeah, clear and obvious, it's a bit vague, isn't it? What's obvious to one person might be totally debatable to someone else.
Exactly. Just saying use it for clear and obvious errors isn't enough. We need to actually define what that means and make sure everyone's on the same page, from the refs to the fans.
So it's all about clarity and consistency, right? If everyone understands the rules, there's less room for confusion and arguments.
Precisely. And that leads us to another really crucial aspect of making VAR work: transparency.
Okay, transparency. Everyone keeps saying that, but what would that actually look like? Would we get to hear the refs talking in the VAR booth?
That's one idea that's been floated, and it's interesting. If fans could hear the discussion, understand why a decision was made, it could help build trust and acceptance, even if they don't agree with the call.
That makes sense. It's like in other sports where you can hear the replay officials talking it out. It feels less like some secret society making decisions behind closed doors,
Exactly. And there are other ways to be more transparent, too, like showing the replays to fans in the stadium and on TV so everyone can see the same angles the VAR officials are looking at.
So more transparency could be a game changer, you'd think. It might not stop all the arguments, but at least it could make the process seem more fair and less random.
That's the hope, at least. But even with better transparency, there are still some fundamental questions about how VAR interacts with the rules themselves, especially the ones that, well, involve some interpretation.
Right, like handball.
Hmm.
Even with perfect replays, there's still room for different opinions. So how do we balance technology with those gray areas? That's a tough one.
It is a tough one, and that's exactly what we'll be exploring in the next part of this deep dive.
Stay tuned, everyone, because we're about to get into the nitty-gritty of how VAR is forcing us to rethink some of the most basic parts of football. Okay, so before we went off on that whole transparency thing, you were going to explain how VAR is making us rethink those gray areas in the rules.
Right, right. The subjective stuff, the judgment calls. It's like VAR has shown this giant spotlight on all those rules that, are open to interpretation, like handball. Even with replays, it often comes down to, well, someone's opinion. And that's when things get really, really heated.
It's true. Some people are saying we need to rewrite the whole rule book to make things more black and white, while others think that, that kind of ambiguity is part of what makes football so interesting.
Yeah, that's the dilemma, isn't it? Do we sacrifice some of the nuance, the flow of the game, all for the sake of perfect accuracy? It's a tough question.
So maybe, like, rewriting the entire rule book is a bit extreme, but are there any other solutions for, dealing with these subjective calls?
Well, there's one idea that's been gaining some traction. It's called the margin of error concept, and it's actually inspired by cricket. They use something similar in their decision review system, DRS.
Cricket, huh? Okay, I'm listening.
So with DRS, they use technology to review certain decisions, just like VAR. But instead of trying to be absolutely perfect, they actually build in a margin of error for those close calls. For example, with LBW decisions, that's leg before wicket, for those who don't follow cricket, there's an allowance for, the natural way the ball moves.
So they're basically saying, hey, technology isn't perfect, and there's always going to be some human judgment involved.
Exactly. And some people think that bringing a similar margin of error into VAR could, well, help reduce some of the frustration around those borderline decisions. It wouldn't be about obsessing over millimeters anymore. There'd be this acceptable range, which would give referees more flexibility.
I like that. It feels more, more in line with how football's supposed to be, allowing for those almost moments that make the game so exciting. But how would you actually, implement a margin of error with VAR?
It would take some serious work, for sure. The rulemaking bodies, the referees, the technology people, they'd all need to get together and figure out, the right margin for different types of calls. Maybe they could use data analysis to help with that.
Sounds complicated. But if it helps to make VAR less, less intrusive, more in tune with the spirit of the game, then maybe it's worth it.
I think so, too. It's all about finding that balance between precision and preserving, the natural flow and excitement of football.
Okay, so we've talked about transparency, the margin of error. Anything else we could tweak or adjust to make the whole VAR experience better?
Well, we could definitely improve the time it takes for reviews. I mean, those long pauses can be a real momentum killer. Some leagues are trying out time limits for reviews, but it's tricky.
Right. You don't want to rush the refs, but you also don't want the game to turn into this stop and start thing.
Exactly. It's about finding that sweet spot, enough time for a good review, but not so much that it ruins the flow of the game.
So basically with VAR, it seems like it's all about balance, right? Technology versus human judgment, precision versus the spirit of the game, speed versus accuracy.
Couldn't have said it better myself. The future of VAR depends on finding those points of balance, those compromises. It's not about eliminating controversy altogether, but about managing it in a way that actually makes football better.
And speaking of making things better, we haven't really talked about how VAR has affected the players. I mean, it must be weird knowing that every move you make could be, analyzed by cameras and replay officials.
You're right. We should talk about that. From a player's point of view, VAR has definitely added a layer of, well, uncertainty and pressure. Like we said before, goal celebrations aren't as spontaneous, and players might be more cautious in certain situations, because they know any contact could be reviewed.
Imagine being a defender in the penalty area. Every tackle, every challenge suddenly feels way riskier.
Absolutely. And that psychological side of things is really important. Some research suggests that VAR has actually led to fewer risky tackles, which could change the way the game is played.
It's almost like VAR has introduced this element of, I don't know, self-censorship. Players second-guessing themselves because they know they're being watched all the time.
That's an interesting point. And it raises questions about the unintended consequences of technology. Is VAR making the game too clean? Is it taking away from the natural flow and spontaneity?
Those are some big questions, and they deserve more discussion. But before we get too philosophical, I think it's time to start looking ahead. What can we realistically expect from VAR in the coming years?
That's a great transition to the final part of our deep dive, because as we've seen, VAR isn't just a technological thing. It's sparked this whole conversation about what football is, what it should be in the 21st century.
Okay, let's get into it then. Stay tuned, folks, because we're going to wrap up this VAR deep dive with some final thoughts on the future of the game and what it all means for, well, the beautiful game. All right, welcome back for the last part of our VAR deep dive. We've talked about a lot, toenail offsides, the impact on players, you name it. But as we look ahead, the big question is, where does VAR go from here?
Well, one thing's for sure, I don't think VAR is going anywhere. It's just become such a fundamental part of football now. Hard to imagine the game without it.
Yeah, true. But we've also seen there's definitely room for improvement, right? Finding that balance like we've been talking about. Technology and human judgment, precision and the spirit of the game. It's not easy.
It's not. It's about using technology to make the game better, not to, I don't know, take over completely. And that means constantly looking at how VAR is used and making changes when we need to.
So what would a more refined, future-proof VAR system look like? We talk about more transparency. And I think most fans would agree that, being able to actually see and hear how decisions are made would be a huge improvement.
Transparency is definitely key. Imagine a system where fans in the stadium and the ones watching at home could see the same replays the VAR officials are seeing, maybe even hear them talking it through. It would add this whole other level of understanding of being involved in the process.
That's a great idea. It would demystify the whole thing. And maybe, just maybe, it would help people accept those decisions a little more, even if they don't go their team's way.
Exactly. It's about trust, right? Trusting the system. And that's important because ultimately VAR is just a tool. It's still people making the final call.
And people make mistakes, which brings us back to that idea of a margin of error, like they have in cricket. It kind of makes sense, admitting that perfection isn't really possible and giving you a bit more leeway on those close calls.
I think that's got a lot of potential. It could cut down on all the arguments about millimeters and let the game flow a bit more naturally.
Yeah, it's about accepting that there's always going to be some subjectivity in football and finding ways for technology to work with that, not against it.
Exactly. And that's why the conversations between the rule makers, the refs, and the technology people are so important. It's a constant back and forth, trying to find what works best.
And maybe this whole VAR thing will make us think differently about the rules themselves. Do some rules need to be changed to work better with technology? Do we need to change what we expect from a fair result?
That's a really interesting question. Maybe VAR isn't just about fixing mistakes. Maybe it's about making us think harder about the game itself.
Because VAR has challenged us, right? Challenged us to question our assumptions and figure out what's really important in football.
I think that's a great way to put it. VAR isn't just a technology. It's a catalyst for a whole new conversation about the future of football.
And that's a conversation every fan should be a part of. Because at the end of the day, the future of VAR is up to us. We get to decide how this technology is used, how it shapes the game we love. So, to wrap things up, I'm going to leave you with a challenge. If you could design the perfect VAR system, what would it look like? What would be the most important parts? How would you balance the technology with, the human element? Keep thinking about those questions, keep talking about them, and most importantly, keep enjoying the beautiful game, VAR and all